हम्म। भैया। So good morning everyone. Today we will study the vocabulary, whatever vocabulary we have studied, whatever one word substitution we have studied, we will do some more one word substitution and we will solve question based on that. Okay. So some points to keep in your mind that a good vocabulary is required to solve questions of one substitution. Okay, so for solving the questions of one word substitution, you should have good vocabulary. And I have taught you vocabulary with a very good amount. And still in upcoming classes also I will cover some more vocabulary so that you do not miss the question in your exam. Okay, easy method to solve the questions of one word substitution is root method. In this method, with the help of root words, the correct choice can be selected. Okay, so what are basically root words? Root words are the words with which we can form so many sentences. Like crazy is the root word. Crazy is the root word, which means to rule or government. Okay, likewise, we have a word like democracy. What do you mean by democracy? Is basically a government which is ruled by people. Aristocracy, government which is ruled by nobles. Oligarchy, nobilocracy. Okay, so there are by root words we can form so many other words. Okay, I will teach you root words also in upcoming classes, so don't worry about that. Before selecting the correct choice, first read the question with its given choice carefully. Before selecting any question, you have to basically go through it in a very detailed manner so that you do not do it wrong. Okay. So first question, audience. What is audience? Audience are basically a large number of people who are listening to you. Okay, large number of people who are listening to you. They are basically audience or spectators. You can say basically whenever you go to see a football match or any match, you see a large crowd sitting in the stadium. So you can say they are basically spectator or audience. Second is altruist. Altruist is basically a person who thinks for the welfare about others. Okay, he is basically who considers the happiness and well-being of others first. मतलब दूसरों को first he want to see others happiness, then he want to see his happiness. And what who is atheist? Atheist is basically a person who does not believe in the existence of God. Okay, anthropologist is the person who studies the humankind. Okay, anthropology is the study of humankind. Anthropology is the study of humankind. Anthropologist is a person who study the evolution of humankind. Okay, what is autocracy? Autocracy again, yeah, here word comes crazy. Crazy means rule basically. And auto means single person. So auto is basically a government by one people. And autobiography, auto again biography, and auto single person. Okay, so basically, what is autobiography? It is a book written by any person for himself on him. Okay, amputate is basically a cut off part of body, you can say. Okay, and sprinter, that day I also told you sprinter, spinster, spin, spinster is basically a small part of any wood that you can say is spinster. Arsenal is basically a place where ammunition are kept. Arsenal is a place where ammunitions are kept. Okay. Whenever you go to, if you are in NCC or any other department, then you can see there are basically arsenals in their units. Okay. Again, next word is archives. Archive is basically a place where government records are kept. Archives is a place where government records are kept for a long time. Okay, there are basically a different so many archives in the country where our historical or public records are kept. They have been kept secure and they are also accessible to public. Amateur is basically a person who does a thing for pleasure and not as profession. Amateur, you can say basically a person who is new to that field. Okay, or you can say he's beginner. Okay, aristocracy. I told you aristocracy again rule. Aristo is basically a noble people, so it is basically a government by nobles. Aquatic again, this is related to fish, animals, and plants which live in water. Amphibians, these live in both water and land. Animals which live both on both land and water. Ambidexter is basically a person who can use either of hand. Matlab, a person who can ride with his both hands is ambidexter. Alimony is basically you can say allowance paid to wife on legal separation. Okay, there are so many alimony cases which are going on Supreme Court nowadays. Okay, anthropology again, this is a study of humankind or anthology. This is anthology. Anthology is collection of poems. Collection of poem is anthology. Next word is abdiction. Abdicate is basically to give up. Seed. seat, give up. Okay, so voluntarily giving up of throne in favor of someone. Okay, arbitrator is basically a mediator, you can say, mediator for the two parties. Astronomer, a person who studies about stars, planet, and other heavenly objects which are related to sky. Okay, astrologer who studies the heavenly bodies. Okay, and he's basically the astrologer basically studies the impact of humanly bodies on humans. Okay, and anthology, again I told you, it is basically a collection of poem. Axiom is basically a, what is axiom? It is a statement which is accepted as true, bro. एग्जाम क्या होता है बेसिकली? ये खुद में एक प्रूफ होता है। क्या होता है? प्रूफ होता है ये खुद। ठीक है ना? लाइक वी हैव स्टडीड एग्जाम्स और postulates. Okay, so exams are basically the statement which are true in self. Okay, agenda, you can say before a meeting we make an agenda, like what point we will discuss. That is basically agenda. Anarchist is basically a person, one who is out to destroy all government. Basically, one person who want to destroy everything of government and all is basically anarchist. Almanac is basically an annual calendar with positions of star. Almanac is basically annual calendar with positions of star. Bigamy, by means to game, जो भी गेम है, गेम इज बेसिकली रिलेटेड टू मैरिज। तो जहाँ पे क्या होगा बेसिकली, गेम ऑफ टू मैरिजेस हैविंग टू वाइफ्स। ओके, bibliophile is, file is again a root word which means love. Okay, bibliophile is basically related to, by you can relate it with Bible. So a person who is lover of Bible is basically a lover of books or collection. Bouquet is basically correction of flowers. Bureaucracy, a government by officials, is bureaucracy. Biennial is basically an event which happens in 2 years. Sorry, an event which happens once in 2 year. वो इवेंट 2 साल में एक बार हो तो क्या बोलेंगे? ब्लास्फेमी इज बेसिकली किसी रिलीजियस चीज के बारे में क्या है, बेसिकली बुरा भला कहना। ओके, क्रेंचे इज बेसिकली a nursery where children are cared for while their parents are. Cringe is, you can say, basically is a place where small children are kept when their parents don't have anyone at home and their parents want to go to the office, so they keep their parents for the care at cringe. Okay, cosmopolitan is basically a person who regards whole world as his country. मतलब वो चाहता है कि दुनिया मेरी क्या है, दुनिया मेरा घर है। ओके, chauffeur is basically a driver. Chauffeur is basically a driver. Okay, जिसको रखा गया हो ड्राइविंग के लिए। ओके, curator, curator is basically a person in charge of museum is curator. Carnivorous who eats meat and flesh. Cannibal who eats human flesh. Contemporaries belonging to a same time. Clockroom, place where things are kept, luggage and all at railway station. Cynosure is basically a center of attraction. Cynosure is basically center of attraction. And connoisseur is basically a critical judge of any art and craft is basically connoisseur, or you can say lover of art. Okay, crusade is basically a religious war. Crusade is basically a religious war is crusade. choreographer. So next word is basically choreographer. Choreographer is basically a person who teaches to dance. Is choreographer, or who makes your drama or skit, helps you in making that. Is basically a choreographer. Okay. Cacographist. Caco again, graph is basically related to a person who is bad in spellings. Caco is bad. Cacophony. Bad voice. Okay. Cacographist is basically a person who is bad in spellings. Calligraphist, again, a person who writes beautiful handwriting, is basically calligraphist. Okay. And cynic is basically a person who sneers at the aims and beliefs of his fellow men. मतलब उसके खुद के belief नहीं है, उनके दूसरों के ये करता follow करता है. Okay. Convalescent is basically a person who is recovering from his health. Cavalry is basically a soldier who fights on horse. Cardiologist is basically a person who is specialized in heart disease. Cartographer is basically a person who draws maps. Dormitory is basically a place where sleeping rooms are available. Okay. And drawn is basically a game that results neither in victory. Okay, draw. It is basically a draw, where nobody wins, nobody loses. Elegy, elegy is basically a poem of lamentation. Lament means basically criticization. Okay, is basically elegy. Epitaph is basically, you can say, there are words written on the grave or tombs. That is basically epitaph. Ephemeral is basically lasting for 1 day or temporary for 1 to 2 days. Okay, effeminate. Effeminate is basically a person who is womanist. A person who likes women is called basically effeminate. Okay, immigrant is basically a person who leaves own country and goes to another country for living. Okay, edible is basically something which is fit to eat. Egotism is basically ego. You can remember it by, like, basically some people do have ego, like they want to listen to themselves rest than listening to others. So basically he is basically egotism, who praises self always and every time. Encyclopedia is basically a encyclopedia is basically a book that contains informations on various subjects, is basically a encyclopedia. Epicure is basically one who is devoted to the pleasure of eating and drinking. Is epicure, जिसको खाना और पीना ही पसंद है. Okay. Florist is basically a person who deals with flowers. तुमने देखा होगा, जैसे बाहर जाते हो फ्लावर्स की शॉप लगाते हैं, तो there are shops, flower shops, where that person is basically is almost specialized in that thing. So he is basically florist. Next word is basically fastidious. Fastidious is basically a person who is basically selective in taste. कि मतलब क्या है, सेलेक्टिव खाना है, ऐसा नहीं कुछ भी खा लिया, उसको जो पसंद है वो क्या है वही खाएगा. ठीक है. फैनेटिक इज बेसिकली a कट्टर, वन हु इज फिल्ड विद एक्सेसिव एंड मिस्टेकन enthusiasm in religious matter. मतलब क्या एक ही साइड है, उसको कोई फर्क ही नहीं पड़ता. Like you can say nowadays people are supporting one party like anything. So they are basically fanatic. Fatal is basically causing death, किसी की हत्या करना. Fatalist is basically a person who believes in fate. Person who believes in fate is basically a fatalist. And face smile is basically exact copy of printing. An exact copy of handwriting or printing is basically a facsimile. Fauna is basically the animals of certain region, and flora is basically plants. Fratricide is basically, fratry is basically brother. So fratricide is basically murder. Fratricide is basically murder of brother. Okay. And fugitive. Fugitive is basically one who runs from justice or the law. Is basically is fugitive. Fragile is weak, which can be broken very easily. Feminist is basically a person who works for the welfare of women. Is basically feminist. Granary is a place where grains are kept. Genocide, a murder of basically a race. Gregarious is basically a social. Gregarious. Gregarious is basically also social. Okay, friendly you can say. Okay, which can mix with everyone. Okay, hangar is a place for keeping aeroplanes. Okay, highway is a place where bees are kept. Horticulture is basically cultivating and managing gardens. Gardens is basically horticulture. Homicide is basically again murder of man. Hearse is basically a vehicle which is used to carry a dead body is called hearse. Hearse. Okay. Hedonist is basically a person who is basically pleasure in the chief good. Basically a person who is love sensual pleasure is called hedonist. Okay, horizon is basically a line at which the earth and the sky meet. You can say when evening if you are sitting on the river side or the seaside, then you can see a place where earth and the river will be meeting. So at point where you will find them meeting will be the horizon. Okay. Honorary is basically the it is a post holding office without any remuneration. Remuneration is basically salary. Okay. System. Okay. Heretic is basically a person who is against who basically acts against a religion is basically heretic. And herbivores are the animals which eats or lives on herbs. Insolent is basically a person who do not have money, जिसका दिवालिया निकल गया हो, unable to pay his debts and all. Inaudible sound which is not can't be heard is basically inaudible. Inaccessible is something you can't access, easily approached is basically inaccessible. इनकॉरिजिबल इज बेसिकली कोई भी चीज जिसको क्या है ठीक नहीं किया जा सको. इरिपेरेबल कोई भी चीज जिसको रिपेयर नहीं किया जा सको. इलिजिबल जिसको क्या है बेसिकली लिखा नहीं जा सक पढ़ा नहीं जा सको. इनएविटेबल मतलब कोई चीज को क्या है अब होने से रोका नहीं जा सको. इम्प्रैक्टिकेबल मतलब क्या है किसी चीज की प्रैक्टिस नहीं की जा सकती हो. और इमिग्रेंट क्या है बेसिकली जो कि पर्सन क्या है पर्सन इमिग्रेंट बेसिकली दूसरी कंट्री से क्या आ रहा हो अपनी कंट्री में आ रहा हो सेटल होने के लिए उसको क्या बोलेंगे इमिग्रेंट. ओके. इनविंसिबल इज बेसिकली वन हु स्ट्रॉन्ग मतलब क्या बेसिकली इनविंसिबल जिसको कोई क्या है हरा नहीं सकता उसको क्या बोलेंगे बेसिकली इनविंसिबल. इनडिलीबल इज बेसिकली क्या है जिसको इरेज ही नहीं किया जा सके. क्या है जिसको इरेज ही नहीं किया जा सके वो क्या होगा बेसिकली इनडिलीबल. और इनकॉग्निटिव क्या होता है बेसिकली कोई ट्रेवलिंग अंडर अनदर मैन दैट वंस. इकोगनेटो बेसिकली क्या होता है हिडन. इकोगनेटो मतलब क्या होता है बेसिकली दिखाई नहीं देता. ट्रेवलिंग अंडर अनदर मैन दैट वंस ओन किसी दूसरे अंडर के क्या अंदर क्या काम करना. इन डिफेटिगेबल मतलब क्या है जो कभी क्या है कभी टायर्ड ही नहीं होता हो. इनफेलिएबल मतलब क्या है बेसिकली जिस जो कि क्या है, बंदा हर एक मिस्टेक हर एक फेल्यूर से क्या हो फ्री हो, उसको क्या बोलेंगे, इनफेलिएबल। इनविजिलेटर क्या है, जो सुपरवाइज करता हो एग्जाम एग्जाम वगैरह। इट इटिनरेंट क्या होता है बेसिकली, जो कि क्या है, एक जगह से दूसरी जगह जाता हो। वन हु जर्नी फ्रॉम प्लेस टू प्लेस इज बेसिकली इटिनरेंट। ओके। इनफर्म इज बेसिकली अ रूम और होम used for ill or injured people is basically infirm. Infirmary. Infirm, you can remember it with infirm is weak, feeble, fragile, weak, fragile, and all. Okay. Infanticide is with side again is the murder. Infant is basically baby. So infanticide is murder of an infant. Infantry is basically a soldiers on foot who fights on foot. Inflammable, something which can catch fire easily. Okay. Intergenum. What is intergenum? Intergenum is basically a period between two a period between two governments. Like you can say there is a gap. You can remember it by a movie मूवी के बीच में क्या होता है, गैप होता है ना, तो क्या होता है बेसिकली, दैट इज इंटरगेनम। ठीक है। या दो रीजन्स के बीच में होगा या दो गवर्नमेंट्स के बीच में होगा, उसको क्या बोलेंगे, इंटर। कैनल इज बेसिकली अ प्लेस वेयर डॉग्स आर केप्ड एंड lunatic asylum इज बेसिकली अ एक ऐसी जगह जहाँ पे क्या बेसिकली lunatic पीपल को रखा जाता है। मतलब lunatic क्या होता है बेसिकली, मैड इंसेंट पीपल। ओके। Lexicographer is basically a person who compiles dictionary is lexicographer. And loquacious is basically जो कि क्या है, बहुत बात करते रहता है, talkative person. Okay, linguistic is basically who is skilled in so many foreign languages. Lepidist, lepidist is basically person who cuts precious stones. And misanthrope is basically a person who is hater of mankind. Misogynist is basically a person who is against marriage or hates marriage. Mortuary, a place where dead bodies are kept. Mercenary is basically a person who works only for money. Matricide is basically a murder of mother. Marita is basically one who dies for the noble cause or one who dies for the country, one who do supreme sacrifice for the country. Maiden speech is basically maiden is first. So maiden speech is basically first speech delivered by person. Mint is basically a coin. Mint is basically a coin. A place where coins are kept is coins are made is basically mint. Misogynist is basically a hater of womankind. Morgue is basically जहाँ पे क्या है, डेड बॉडीज को आइडेंटिफिकेशन के लिए भेजा जाता है। ठीक है। मैमल्स क्या होते हैं बेसिकली, जो कि क्या देते हैं, एनिमल्स विच गिव्स मिल्क। मोनोगेमी क्या है, एक ही शादी करना। मिशनरी इज बेसिकली अ पर्सन हु इज सेंट टू, मतलब क्या है, किसी को क्या करना, किसी पर्सन को क्या करना, अपने रिलीजन को प्रोपोगेट करने के लिए भेजना। जैसे अभी तुमने देखा हो क्रिश्चियन मिशनरीज वगैरह होंगी, तो क्या बेसिकली दे वांट टू प्रोपोगेट देयर रिलीजन। ओके। न्यू न्यूमिनिस्टिक्स क्या होता है बेसिकली, इट इज स्टडी ऑफ कॉइन्स। न्यूमिनिस्टिक्स बेसिकली स्टडी ऑफ कॉइन्स। नेम चेक इज बेसिकली क्या है, कोई नाम का ही है। अ पर्सन हैविंग सेम नेम एज अनदर, मेरे नाम जैसा दूसरा। Nostalgia is basically a strong desire to home, or basically a homesick person is basically a nostalgia. Or novice is basically new to something, new to anything, or inexperience. Narcotic is basically a medicine for producing sleep. इस medicine से क्या है, नींद आती है, उसको क्या बोलते हैं। Okay. Optimistic is basically a person who sees positive side of everything. Okay, orphan is basically a person who lost his parents. Omnipresent is basically a person who is present everywhere or one who is present everywhere. Omnipotent is basically one who have all power. Omniscient is basically a person who knows everything. Opaque is basically जिसके थ्रू हम क्या है देख नहीं सकते. ऑबिचुअरी इज बेसिकली एन अकाउंट इन द न्यूज, मतलब क्या है, जहाँ पे न्यूज़पेपर में फन या डेथ, जिनकी डेथ हो जाती है उनके बारे में लिखा जाता है। एंड ऑर्फनेज इज बेसिकली अ प्लेस वेयर ऑर्फन पीपल आर केप्ट। ऑब्स्ट्रिशियन इज बेसिकली अ पर्सन हु इज बेसिकली इन skilled in midwife midwife okay। hostler is basically a person who looks after the horse at in, जो कि हॉर्स वगैरह की देखभाल करता है। omnivorous जो कि क्या है, कुछ भी खाता है, who can eat everything। pessimistic is basically a person who looks at the darker side of something, मतलब कोई अच्छी चीज है उसकी भी नेगेटिव साइड को उसको देखना ही। पोर्टेबल, कोई चीज क्या हो, फिट फॉर ड्रिंकिंग। पोस्टमार्टम, किसी डेड बॉडी का क्या करना, एग्जामिनेशन करना। फिलेंट्रोपिक, जो कि क्या है, दयालु हो, मतलब इंसानियत को पसंद करता हो। पेट्रीसाइड इज बेसिकली मर्डर ऑफ फादर। फिलाटिस्ट इज बेसिकली जो कि क्या करता हो, स्टेम्स कलेक्ट करता हो, क्या है, फिल लव टेलिस्ट स्टेम। तो बेसिकली क्या है, जो स्टेम्स को प्यार करता है उसको क्या बोलेंगे, बेसिकली फिलाटेलिस्ट। प्लेगरिज्म इज बेसिकली अगेन किसी का काम चुरा के लिखना इज बेसिकली प्लेगरिज्म। लिटरेरी थेफ्ट और पासिंग ऑफ एन ऑथर्स ओरिजिनल वर्क एज वंस, तो किसी दूसरे की चीज को खुद का बना के देना इज बेसिकली प्लेगरिज्म। पॉलीगैमी इज द प्रैक्टिस ऑफ मैरिंग मोर देन वन मैरिज एट अ टाइम इज बेसिकली पॉलीगैमी। Polyandry is basically the practice of marrying more than one husband at a time is basically polyandry। Andry मतलब man, you can say। Okay, so with this you can remember poly means so many, so at a time having so many husband is polyandry। Philogynist is basically a person who is lover of humankind। Plebiscite, site is basically a decision made by votes of all qualified citizens is basically, मतलब क्या है, कोई भी डिसीजन जो कि क्या है, क्वालिफाइड वोटर्स या क्वालिफाइड सिटीजन्स ने लिया उसको क्या बोलेंगे, प्लेबिसाइट। ओके। फिलांडर इज बेसिकली वन हु अम्यूजेस हिमसेल्फ बाय लव मेकिंग, तो बेसिकली क्या है, फिल्म मतलब अगेन लव एंड मैन जो कि क्या है, खुद को क्या करता हो, ज्यादा पसंद करता हो, बेसिकली फिलांडर, मतलब प्यार से वो करता हो। ओके। फिलिस्तीन, फिलिस्टाइन, Philistine is basically a person who does not care about art and literature. Is plutocracy again is Pluto. You can remember it by Pluto पे कौन जा सकता है, रिच लोग। तो रिच लोग की प्लूटो पे कौन जा सकता है, रिच लोग। और इसका मतलब क्या होता है, रूल। तो बेसिकली ये प्लूटोक्रेसी इज गवर्नमेंट बाय रिच पीपल। जस्ट Pseudonym is basically an imaginary name assumed by author to disguise himself is basically pseudonym or anonymous we you can say. Posthumous is basically a children born after the death of his father or the book published after the death of any writer is basically posthumous. Polyglot is basically a one who speaks so many languages is basically polyglot. Paleography is basically the study of ancient writing. Possess is basically a number of policemen called to querel a riot is basically a policeman number of policemen called to quell a riot. Parole is basically prisoner को temporary relief देना. ठीक है. टेम्पररी रिलीफ देना मतलब बाहर जाने के लिए उसको. ठीक है. पोर्टेबल क्या है मतलब किसी चीज को एक जगह से दूसरी जगह आसानी से लेके जाया जा सके दैट इज बेसिकली पोर्टेबल. क्वारंटाइन मतलब क्या है किसी चीज को मतलब लोगों को क्या बेसिकली या किसी चीज को लोगों से अलग रखा जाए टू प्रिवेंट किसी चीज का इन्फेक्शन फैलना जैसे कोविड में रखा गया था. रियोटोरिक इज बेसिकली मतलब क्या है एक द आर्ट ऑफ एलिगेंस मतलब क्या है बेसिकली एक लिखने की कला होना या फिर बोलने की कला होना. Regicide, again, regicide is basically a murder of king or queen. Sacrilege basically किसी मतलब पवित्र जगह को क्या करना खराब करना दैट इज sacrilege. Sculpture basically जो कि stones वगैरह क्या करता हो कट करता हो. Suicide is murder of basically oneself. Stable is basically a place where horses are kept is basically stable. One is basically सोमनेबुलिस्ट मतलब क्या है बेसिकली एक ऐसा पर्सन जो क्या है नींद में सोता हो. सेकंड वन इज सोमनीलॉक्विस्ट मतलब क्या होता है बेसिकली जो कि पर्सन नींद में बात करता हो. कल बताया था लॉक का मतलब क्या होता है टू स्पीक. क्या होता है टू स्पीक. इसी से वर्ड आया है क्या एलोक्वेंट. प्रेशियस. सोवेनियर इज बेसिकली क्या है किसी चीज का क्या है रिमाइंडर देना. अ थिंग केप्ट एज अ रिमाइंडर ऑफ अ पर्सन प्लेस इज बेसिकली सोवेनियर. स्वैन सॉन्ग इज बेसिकली the last work of a writer is basically a swan song, especially literature. Short topper is basically one who is a habitual drunkard. Habitual drunkard is basically short topper. Sinecure is basically a job with high salary but little responsibility is basically sinecure. Stoic जिसको कोई फर्क ही नहीं पड़ता हो. Sanatorium जहाँ पे क्या है बेसिकली सिक लोगों को रिकवर होने के लिए रखा जाए दैट इज बेसिकली सैनिटोरियम. सोरोसाइड इज बेसिकली सोरो मतलब सिस्टर. साइड मतलब मर्डर. So sorrowcide is murder of sister. Triennial is basically an event which happens once in a 3 years basically triennial. And biennial is basically an event which happens once in 2 years. Truant is Truant is a person or a student who absent himself from class or duty without permission is basically a truant. Okay, teetotaler is basically क्या है one who does not take any intox मतलब क्या है जो कि कुछ नहीं खाता पीता हो इंटॉक्सिकेटेड उसको क्या बोलेंगे टीटोलर. ट्रांसपेरेंट क्या है जिसके थ्रू क्या है हम सब देख सकते हैं इज बेसिकली ट्रांसपेरेंट. ओके. थियोक्रेसी इज बेसिकली अ गवर्नमेंट बाय रिलीजियस प्रिंसिपल एंड यूरोक्सियस इज बेसिकली वन हु इज फॉन्ड ऑफ वंस वाइफ इज बेसिकली यूरोक्सियस. उथोपिया इज बेसिकली इमेजिनरी प्लेस और इमेजिनरी और परफेक्ट प्लेस वेयर एवरीथिंग इज राइट इज बेसिकली यूटोपिया जहाँ पे क्या आइडियल सिटी रहने के लिए हो बट ऐसा कुछ होता नहीं. ओके. Uroxicide is basically a murder of wife. Okay, you can remember it by X danger. So uroxicide is murder. So uroxicide will be murder of wife. Verbatism is basically repeating same word or speech again and again is basically verbatim. वॉलेंटियर वन हु ऑफर्स वन सर्विसेज, मतलब क्या है, कोई खुद से वर्क करना चाहे, दैट इज बेसिकली वॉलेंटियर. एंड वर्जिन इज बेसिकली a woman who has no sexual experience, is basically virgin. Versatile is basically someone who is interested and clever at many different things, is basically versatile. He knows so many other things, is versatile. And veteran is basically a person who has served for so long in a particular service, is basically a veteran. Vinyl, vinyl is basically a fault that may be forgiven, is basically vinyl. Wardrobe is basically a place where clothes are kept, is basically wardrobe. Now, basically, these are some of the words which are seen in exam so many times, and they are given with different things, different forms. Like sometimes they are asking correcting the spelling. So, what are the correct spelling of the words? Okay, now we will go for model questions, and the above words you can read. They are basically for reading, and once you read, you will be able to write the correct spelling of the word. We will start from the first word. First word is an office or a post with no work but high pays, basically ex gratia or honorary. Okay. P. साइन क्योर कराया था मैंने. साइन क्योर. An office or a post with no work but high pay is basically a sign क्योर. ओके. क्या बोलते हैं इसको, जहाँ पे क्या है खाली कोई पोस्ट, बड़ी पोस्ट हो और कोई काम नहीं है, उसको क्या बोलते हैं, साइन क्योर. ओके. एंड बेसिकली मर्डर ऑफ ब्रदर इज बेसिकली patricide. A person living permanently in a certain place, then basically he is the domicile of that particular place. To slap with a flat object is basically swat. To slap with a flat object is basically swat. Regard for others is a principle of action. Regard for others, principle of action is basically altruism. अल्ट्रिज्म, दूसरों के बारे में सोचता हो, that is basically regard for others as a principle of action is yes, altruism. Okay. Next, a person who believes that God is everything and everything is God is basically theist. Theist is basically who believes in existence of God. A theist is do not believe in existence of God. Simple and smallest form of plant life present in air, water, and small soil. Soil essential to life, but may cause disease is basically virus. Is basically bacteria. Bacteria. Relationship by birth or blood is basically consanguinity. Consanguinity is relationship by birth or blood. Opposed to great or sudden change is basically evolutionary or conservative. Conservative. Opposed to great change or opposed to great or sudden change is basically conservative. Walking in sleep is basically somnambulist. And somniloquism is basically जो कि क्या है नींद में बात करता हो. Hallucination is basically मतलब पता है ना वो क्या बोलते हैं उसको. अगर किसी चीज को एक ही बार उसको कंसंट्रेट करके देखा जाए तो वो हेलुसिनेट होने लगती है, मतलब हर जगह दिखने लगती है. दैट इज बेसिकली हेलुसिनेशन. Belief or opinion contrary to what is generally accepted is basically heresy. Heresy is basically belief or opinion contrary to what is generally accepted. A person who kills somebody, especially for political reasons, is basically assassination. Assassination. A person who rules without consulting the opinion of others is basically autocrat. Study of mankind is basically an anthropology. Anthropology is basically a study of mankind through which light cannot be passed is basically obscure. Stealing from the writing of others is basically plagiarism. A short stay at a place is basically halt, intermission, or interlude. Is basically sojourn. Is basically a short stay at a place. Okay, whatever the words you are not getting or you are hearing for the first time, please do write them. They will help you in remembering, and also next time if you see them, then you will be able to recall. Constant effort to achieve something is basically perseverance. A person, a person who person not sure of the existence of God is basically atheist or agnostic. Agnostic is basically मतलब sure नहीं है, but atheist is जो कि क्या है मानता ही नहीं है. Design made by putting together colored pieces of glass or stones is basically oleograph. Is okay. One who deserts his religion is basically apostate. Apostate is basically one who deserts his religion. One who uses fear as a weapon of power. One who uses fear as a weapon of power is basically are basically the people who are terrorists. The original inhabitant of country is basically native. A place where birds are kept is basically a aviary. Okay. One who does not care for literature or art is basically Philistine. Philistine. Yes. Philistine. I told you. A man of odd habits is basically cynic, पागल, eccentric. Eccentric is basically जो अपने मन की करता है. Deriving pleasure from inflicting pain or others is basically sadism. Sadism. Yes, sadism is basically deriving pleasure from inflicting pain or pain on others. The power of reading the thoughts of others is basically psychology. Animals living on land and water is are basically amphibians. Are amphibians. A light sailing boat built especially for racing is a light sailing boat built specially for racing yacht. Is yacht. Be the ornament or perfect example of किसी चीज का परफेक्ट एग्जांपल होना या मैस्कुलिन is basically personify करना. A person who maliciously destroy by fire is basically eccentric. Eccentric. A house for storing grains, granary. A name adopted by author in his writing. A name adopted by an author in his writing is pseudonym. मतलब false. Of unknown and unadmitted authorship is basically anonymous. Anonymous is basically जिसका कोई अता पता ही नहीं है. Members of band of member of a band of robbers is basically क्या होते हैं ब्रिगेंड की भी बटालियन होती है. A person who is made to bear the blame due to others is basically scrap god. मतलब क्या है किसी को क्या बनाना बलि का बकरा बनाना. A person who brings goods illegally into the country is basically smuggler. A medical operation after which a man is not able to make a woman pregnant. A medical operation is basically after which a man is not able to make a woman pregnant is basically vasectomy. A person who travels to a sacred place as an act of religious devotion is basically a hermit, hermit or pilgrim. Pilgrim. Food which agrees with one's taste is basically edible, palatable. Is palatable. Palatable. One who loves books is basically bibliophile. Parts of a country behind the coast or river bank is archipelago. नहीं. Isthmus is basically hinterland. A low area storm with a high winds rotating about a center is basically a cyclone. One who promote the idea of absence of government anywhere, any when every man be called unto law is basically anarchist. One who promote the idea of absence of government of any kind when every man should be law unto himself. Something which is not true or profound is basically superstitious or superfluous. Superficial is basically superficial. ऊपर ऊपर से कोई चीज है. Indifferent to pleasure or pain is basically stoicism. Present opposing argument or evidence. Opposing present opposing arguments or evidences is basically rebut. Is rebut. To mediate between two parties is basically interrupt or interfere. It will be basically intercede between. Intercede means basically interfere between two parties. The branch of medical science which deals with the problems of old is basically oncology नहीं, it is basically geriatrics. Geriatrics. Choose the word most appropriate answer for the base following. Canister. Canister is basically a person or a round or cylindrical container used for storing things is basically canister. Can you can remember, जहाँ पे क्या है सामान वगैरह रखा जाता है, ठीक है ना. अबोर्ड मतलब क्या होता है बेसिकली रहने की जगह, और अ प्लेस ऑफ परमानेंट रेसिडेंसी मतलब अबोर्ड इज बेसिकली योर होम. ओके. वार्डरोब जहाँ पे क्या है बेसिकली क्लॉथ वगैरह रखे जाते हैं. ग्रेट्युटी मतलब क्या है बेसिकली रिटायरमेंट के बाद जो पैसा मिलता है, दैट इज बेसिकली ग्रेट्युटी. मनी पेड टू एम्प्लॉय ऑन रिटायरमेंट इज बेसिकली ग्रेट्युटी. हेलो. अभी तो पता नहीं क्या बोल रही थी. वो एलोटेशन याद नहीं था. कुछ भी नहीं. ठीक है. हाईलाइटर सेलेक्ट करना था ना, तो उसमें हाईलाइटर सेलेक्ट किया. मान भी नहीं रहा. तो दोनों से ऐसे हाईलाइटर वो यूज करते हैं ना उस पर. ये उससे हटेगा वो तीन डॉट, वो पेंसिल आती है ना यहाँ पे साइड में लिखने के लिए, नोटेशन करने के लिए. वो पेंसिल आती है. Absolutely. ये बंद तो कर तुमको भी नहीं हो रहा वो। मानो भी। Sorry, there was some problem. So due to which it was stopped for some time. Now the problem is being solved. So we will continue with our lecture. Okay. We were doing question number 54. Gratuity is basically it is a money paid to the person on his retirement is basically a gratuity. Okay. Cacographit is basically one who is cacographist, one who is bad in spelling is basically cacographit. Bankrupt, unable to pay his debt. Feminist, an unknown person. Okay, one who works for the welfare of women is basically a person who is feminist. Misogynist, who hates logical thoughts, who hates everything, who hates. Misologist, sorry, logist is basically words or thoughts. So basically, misologist is basically a person who hates knowledge will be who hates will be misologist. Chauvinist is basically a center of research or a person who is not trustworthy. Chauvinist is basically a person who is blindly devoted. Who is blindly devoted to any idea is basically chauvinist. Sanitarian. Sanitarian is basically a person who is above 100 years is sanitarian. Posthumous is basically something which is given or published after death. Draw is basically a game where nobody wins. Medieval, belonging to the middle age, is basically medieval. Okay. Swashbuckler. Swashbuckler is basically a boastful fellow जो कि क्या है फेंकते रहता है लंबी लंबी अब ब्रेक करते रहता है. ओके. वॉलेंटियर, खुद से किसी काम को करना. वन हु ऑफर्स वन सर्विस. हेरेटिक, one who acts against religion is basically heretic. Referendum, a place where leather is turned no. Journal vote of the public to decide a question is basically referendum. Ornithology. Ornithology is basically a place where wrestling is study of birds is called ornithology. Ornithology. Altruist is again a person who loves everybody. No, an insulting remark, you and cry, guardian angel. Altruist is basically a person who loves everybody. Is altruist. जो सबको प्यार करता है. एंड फिलेंथ्रोपिस्ट क्या है, जो सबको प्यार से हेल्प वगैरह करता है. इज ऑल्सो ओमनीजेंट. मतलब क्या होता है बेसिकली जो की चीज जो कि क्या है, वन हु नोज एवरीथिंग इज बेसिकली ओमनीजेंट. स्वैंग सॉन्ग, किसी का लास्ट लिटरेरी वर्क ऑफ एन आर्टिस्ट इज बेसिकली स्वैंग सॉन्ग. लेक्सियोग्राफर इज बेसिकली वो कंपाइल्स डिक्शनरी. पेंट्री मतलब बेसिकली क्या होता है, A part of army that goes on horse नहीं, a creation हो, place for provision नहीं, हाँ? Pantry, a place for provision in the house. Anthropologist, एंथ्रो ह्यूमन स्टडी, जो कि क्या है बेसिकली ह्यूमंस की स्टडी करता हो या इवोल्यूशन की स्टडी करता हो, उसको क्या बोलेंगे? एंथ्रोपोलॉजिस्ट. ड्रे, ड्रे इज बेसिकली a squirrel's home. Dre is basically a squirrel's home. Okay, now we will select the right meanings. Okay, which one is right? 76B will be the right. Okay, B will be the right. Example, argument, approached, capture, passenger, satellite, committee, corrupt, achievement, gate, gate, foreigner, exaggerate, accurate, forecast, puerile, puerile, entrepreneur, entrepreneur, commission, perseverance, perseverance, illustrious, pitiable, parallel, parallel, veterinary, D, tranquility, tranquility, fulfill, recommend, omnious, temperature, overlapped, overlapped, necessary, benefited, benefited, further it is sacrilege or the sacrilegious, SACRI, and sacrilegious, giraffe, foreign, lackadaisical, and structural, eh, structural, accommodation, inimitable, inimitable, refrigerator, refrigerator, obsession, obsession. Okay. Now below are the words here. You have to see which word is not right and you solve this. Till then we will solve these questions. Government is trying to provide auxiliary service. Auxiliary service means auxiliary service also. It will be temporary. Auxiliary. They are likely to support the policies that are connected to libertarian. That are connected to libertarian. You should not hurt her feelings because she is basically sentimentalist. Senti sentimental. Sentimentalist. I like the architecture of the ancient Greek. The play was good, but an epilogue. Years later, town has plunged on the site of massacre. The elegant rooms are beautiful, decorated with old style furniture and sumptuous fabric. Remo D'Souza is a dense, popular Densio. Mahatma Buddha got his nirvana. I enjoyed a lot of privilege. He was receiving the progress report of project intermittently. A dose, a daily dose of music makes the body and mind rejuvenation. The main focus of the mission was to literate the half of population of that village. Precipitation of soil was the reason for upheaval. Whenever he is asked to do a work, there is a hypocrisy as well. The correspondent from Delhi reported that he is covering the news here. When there is no one to enjoy, with the time goes monotonous. We would like to break our deal as situation has gone irreparable. 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 What is the reason for discrepancy? Discrepancy. Discrepancy. It is advisable. It is advisable. Advisable that you should book tickets in advance for upcoming movie to avoid rush. Last some more PYQs. A government by officials is basically bureaucracy. A person who walks in sleep is basically a somnambulist. Somnambulist commencement or adjacent word with the same letter is basically alliteration. Alliteration. A specialist who tests eyes is basically ophthalmologist. A wall built to prevent the sea or river from flooding and basically dam is basically dike, sorry, not dam. A group of three books film that have the same subject or letter is basically trilogy. Is trilogy. Study of human race is basically anthropology. A remedy for all disease is basically panacea. A place where treasure of art, crucial or preserved or exhibited is basically museum. Associated with God or religion is basically belongs to all part of the world is basically universal, no, cosmopolitan. A study of origin and history of words is basically linguistics. It's basically not linguistic, it's the entomology. Tough tissues in joints is basically ligament. One who goes to settle in another country is basically immigrant. One who hides away on a ship to obtain a free passage is basically a stowaway. Clues available at a scene is basically suggestive. Is basically circumstantial. An unexpected piece of good fortune is basically turnstile, or it is basically windfall. Detaining and confining someone, interrogation, is basically interminant. Out of the alternate, choose the one which is to be fulfilled. Okay. Four words are given in each, out of which one is wrong. Check the wrong word. It will be frequency. It will be frequency, not this. Temperament, bravement, Bravement, handicap, kidnap, frolic, kidnapped. It will be kidnapped, CAPPD. Miscarriage. Miscarriage is wrongly spelled. Deliquis. Deliquis is wrong. Efflorescence. 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 Here you have to select right word. License. Entrepreneur. Equanimity. Embarrassment. A. Okay, now you can solve rest questions. It's also for you. It will be basically veterinary. Hmm. Hmm? अभी नहीं आगे लेक्चर में है, शुरू में ऐसे भी गलती करा देख के आंसर है उनका पहले गलती नहीं उमंग नंबर मेरे को नहीं फोन नहीं उठा दिया देखता हूँ आज उसके बाद नंबर आई से नंबर दे रहा हूँ इसको नहीं होता हाँ करता हूँ बिल्कुल करेगा आज तक द्वारा नहीं उसके बाद नंबर आई से कॉल करने बोलते हैं बस बोलते हैं वो लाइन भरता है नंबर तो दो वो भी तो दो बता it will be veterinary, equanimity, munificent, munificent, CONNO, कौन is there? SCPAB, intrinsic, gregarious, conduit, structural. Rest you can solve. Okay, that's all for today. Solve the questions once again and revise them. And wishing you everyone a very happy Army Day. And hope it will be a last Army Day for you as a civilian and next Army Day in uniform. Thank you. Jai.